I've always dreamed of going on a cruise, so when the chance came up, I jumped at it. My name is Alaska, and I'm 26. So I called my fiance, and we were both super excited to start our vacation. The first day was amazing. We went to this fun evening party on the deck, and the atmosphere was just perfect. Everything was lively, and we had a blast. The next morning, we headed to the dining courtyard for breakfast. It was packed, so many people, barely any empty tables. But the food was great, and the whole experience was just what we'd hoped for. We were both in high spirits, soaking in the sun and the sea. It felt like everything was falling into place perfectly, and I couldn't wait to see what the rest of the trip would bring. As the days went by, something started to feel off. I began noticing this man, always around, but never too close. At first, it was just a weird feeling, but then it got more noticeable. He seemed to pop up wherever I went. I'd see him by the pool, at the buffet, or just standing somewhere, watching from a distance. He was middle-aged, with a scruffy beard and a kind of unsettling stare. It was like he was always just out of the corner of my eye. I didn't want to say anything to my fiancée at first, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. But it was hard to ignore. Every time I looked up, there he was, always in the background. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just coincidence. But it didn't feel right. I couldn't relax knowing someone was paying that much attention to me. One day, things took a turn for the worse. I was coming back from the ladies' bathroom when I saw him again, this time in a place he definitely shouldn't be. He was standing in the middle of the corridor, right outside the bathroom. It was a spot that made no sense for him to be there. The corridor was supposed to be private, not somewhere someone would just hang around. My heart sank when I saw him. I had to pass right by him to get back to my room. As I got closer, I could feel my anxiety spiking. He just stood there, staring at me with that same creepy look. I tried to keep my gaze straight ahead, but I could feel his eyes boring into me. When I was almost past him, he finally spoke up. "Hey, can we talk for a minute?" His voice was calm, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I was already on edge and didn't want to engage with him. I mumbled something about being in a hurry and quickened my pace. I could hear his footsteps start to follow me, but I didn't dare look back. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The fear was overwhelming. I just needed to get away, and fast. Later that day, when I got back to my room, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a handwritten letter slipped under my door, just lying there in the hallway. My hands were shaking as I picked it up and unfolded it. The letter was from him. It was written in neat, slanted handwriting, but the message was anything but reassuring. It said he wanted to talk to me alone, to have a private conversation. The note was polite enough, but it sent chills down my spine. I couldn't ignore the underlying threat. I felt a surge of panic. I didn't want to confront him, and I definitely didn't want my fiancée finding out and causing a scene. I knew he'd be furious if he knew someone was harassing me. The thought of potential conflict made me even more anxious. I decided to just ignore the letter and hope it was the last of his creepy gestures. The last thing I needed was more trouble. As the cruise went on, things just kept getting worse. I started finding more letters in random places, inside the gym, tucked in the corner of a lounge, even in a book I'd been reading. Each one was similar, all with the same unsettling tone, expressing his continued desire to meet with me alone. Every time I found one, my heart would race. It felt like I was being watched all the time, like he was always lurking just out of sight. The letters were becoming more frequent, each one more direct and demanding than the last. My anxiety was through the roof, and the feeling of being stalked was overwhelming. I tried to stay calm, but it was getting harder. I was constantly on edge, dreading each new day because it seemed like he was always one step ahead. I couldn't wait for the cruise to be over. The thought of going home and being away from him was the only thing keeping me going. I just wanted this nightmare to end. As we were packing up to leave, I found one last letter. It was tucked inside one of my suitcase pockets, and when I read it, I felt my blood run cold. The note said, "One day I'll meet you somewhere and we'll talk alone." The message was direct and chilling. I showed the letter to my fiancé immediately. His face turned red with anger as he read it. He wanted to confront the guy right then and there, so he started searching the ship, asking staff if they'd seen anyone matching his description. But by then, most passengers had already disembarked, and the man was nowhere to be found. We spent hours trying to find him, but it was basically like finding a needle in the middle of a cornfield. We still spent close to an hour, but we didn't find him. The cruise ended, and we had to leave without any answers. I was still a bit worried, but my fiancée consoled me and told me that everything would be fine and that I could forget about it. I'm all about exploring abandoned places with my friends, Mike and Will. We've checked out a bunch of old, creepy spots around town, and we're always on the lookout for our next adventure. This time, we decided to hit up an old factory on the outskirts of town. It's been empty for years and is covered in graffiti and decay. The whole place looked like it hadn't been touched in forever, which made it perfect for our kind of exploration. We were really excited about this one. The idea of documenting everything and seeing what kind of hidden stuff we could find always gets us pumped. So we grabbed our gear and headed out, ready to dive into whatever the factory had in store for us. When we got to the factory, it was just as we expected, gutted and covered in grime. The floors were littered with debris, and broken machinery was scattered everywhere. The place had a weird, musty smell that hit us as soon as we walked in. We split up a bit, each of us poking around different sections of the building, taking pictures and trying to find something interesting. As we moved deeper inside, we stumbled across a bunch of locked doors and hidden passages. It felt like there was more to this place than just the main rooms we were seeing. We spent a while trying to pry open some of the doors. Most were stuck tight, but finally we managed to force one open with a crowbar. Beyond that door was a room that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Old equipment was piled up everywhere, rusty machines, dusty tools, and contraptions that looked like they'd been cobbled together from spare parts. We were definitely intrigued, especially with all the strange stuff scattered around. It felt like we just scratched the surface of what this place had to offer. As we explored the room, we noticed a large covered object in the center. It was draped with a dusty sheet, and we could barely make out its shape. Curiosity got the better of us, so we pulled the sheet off to see what was underneath. What we found was pretty unsettling. The object turned out to be a collection of old, disassembled machinery mixed with a bunch of bizarre items. There were strange contraptions and tools that looked like they were made from random parts. But it wasn't just the stuff. It was the notes and blueprints scattered around that really freaked us out. The notes were filled with weird diagrams and scribbles. The blueprints didn't seem to show anything practical or useful. They looked more like the ramblings of someone obsessed with odd inventions. The more we looked, the more we realized that this factory wasn't just abandoned. It had been used for something strange and probably disturbing. The whole vibe of the room made us feel uneasy, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were uncovering something we weren't meant to find. Just as we were about to head out, we heard footsteps echoing down the corridor. The sound was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder. Panic set in, and we froze, unsure of what to do. We huddled together and found a spot to hide behind some old equipment, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps kept getting closer, and our anxiety shot through the roof. Will was peeking through a small gap in the door when he suddenly went pale. He whispered that he saw a shadow through the door, a shadow of an old man and a small boy. The shadow was right outside, and it looked like they were just standing there, listening. The man and the boy seemed to be right on the other side of the door, and then the shadow moved away. We held our breaths, waiting to hear if they'd come into the room, but the footsteps eventually faded. We waited in our hiding spot until we were sure they were gone. The whole situation was so eerie that we could hardly think straight. We knew we had to get out fast. Once the footsteps finally faded away, we didn't waste any time. We bolted out of our hiding spot and made a beeline for the exit. Our nerves were shot, and every little sound seemed amplified as we hurried through the factory. Just as we were almost out, we heard the rumble of an old car approaching. We froze, panic setting in again. We ducked behind some more machinery and held our breath, hoping whoever was driving wouldn't see us. The car slowly drove by, its headlights cutting through the dim light of the factory. After what felt like an eternity, it finally passed and drove off into the distance. With our hearts still pounding, we carefully made our way back to the trail. The journey back felt endless, each step weighed down by the fear and anxiety of what had just happened. The whole experience had left us shaken, and we couldn't wait to put as much distance between us and that creepy factory as possible. After we finally made it back to the starting point, we were all still shaken. We couldn't stop talking about what we'd seen and heard in that factory. The images of the strange equipment and those creepy shadows kept replaying in our minds. We tried to piece together what the factory might have been used for. The weird machinery and bizarre blueprints seemed like clues to something disturbing, but we couldn't make sense of it. The old man and the boy were the scariest part. Why were they there? What were they doing in that abandoned place? The whole experience left us with a deep sense of unease. The factory wasn't just a creepy building. It felt like it had secrets that were meant to stay hidden. It's left a mark on us, and now, thinking about future explorations, we can't help but feel a bit more apprehensive. What if the next place we explore has its own dark surprises? That factory taught us that some places might be better left alone. I was stuck on this desolate stretch of road, far from civilization. My car had conked out a few miles outside of a small town, and of course, I had no cell service. The only thing I could hear was the occasional rustling in the bushes and the distant sounds of the forest. It was so quiet that it felt eerie. As time dragged on, my frustration and anxiety kept building. I paced around a bit, tried to call for help. Nothing worked. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. Just as I was starting to really panic, an old pickup truck appeared out of nowhere. The driver, an older guy who looked to be in his 45s or 55s, pulled over and offered me a ride into town. He seemed friendly enough at first, though he was a bit too chatty for my taste. But I was desperate. I was freezing and exhausted, and the thought of sitting alone on that road all night was too much to bear. So, despite my better judgment, I took him up on his offer. At first, the ride was a relief. The driver was all smiles and chatter, talking about everything from the weather to local news. He seemed genuinely friendly, and I appreciated his company, especially since the alternative was sitting alone on that creepy road. I tried to relax, making small talk and feeling grateful that I was finally getting out of that unsettling spot. But as the ride went on, something started to shift. The driver's mood changed. He went from being chatty and engaging to almost silent. His conversation became more sporadic, and his demeanor grew increasingly serious. At first, I thought maybe he was just tired or focused on driving, but the silence felt off. What really started to freak me out was how often he kept glancing at the back seat. It was subtle at first, but it happened frequently enough that I couldn't ignore it. Each time he looked, my anxiety spiked. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my nerves. Eventually, I asked him if everything was okay, but he just gave me a vague, non-committal answer and kept his eyes on the road. My unease was turning into full-blown fear, but I was trapped in the truck and felt like I couldn't do anything about it. As the minutes passed, the driver's behavior grew even more unsettling. He started speaking as if he were having a conversation with someone in the back seat. The way he addressed this presence was casual, almost like it was an everyday occurrence. His words were nonsensical and jarring, and the more he talked, the more my heart raced. I was frozen in terror, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening, but I couldn't bring myself to ask any more questions. The road was not helping my anxiety. It was getting narrower and darker, winding deeper into the woods. I had been expecting to see signs of the town soon, but instead, we seemed to be getting farther away. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, and the comforting thought of reaching the town was fading quickly. Panic set in as I realized how dire the situation was. My breathing quickened, and every shadow seemed to loom menacingly. I felt utterly trapped, with no clear way to escape. The driver's strange behavior, combined with our increasingly remote location, made me feel like something was seriously wrong. All I wanted was to get out of that truck, but the more we drove, the more powerless and terrified I became. In the midst of my rising panic, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. I spotted the faint glow of lights piercing through the trees, a gas station in the distance. Relief washed over me, even though I knew the journey was far from over. My heart raced with a mix of fear and hope, knowing that this might be my chance to escape the nightmare I was trapped in. As we drew closer to the gas station, I noticed roadwork blocking part of the road. A truck had just left the gas station and was moving slowly past the site, its headlights casting long beams of light. The old man driving me seemed preoccupied with the roadwork and the truck, giving me the opening I desperately needed. He wasn't paying attention to me or the surroundings, focusing instead on the road ahead. Seizing the moment, I decided to act. My heart pounded as I reached for the door handle and yanked it open. The sudden rush of cold air hit me as I jumped out of the moving truck. The impact with the ground was rough. I tumbled and scraped my arms and legs, the pain sharp and immediate. Despite the bruises and scratches, the fear of being captured kept me moving. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the throbbing pain, and sprinted toward the gas station. Each step was fueled by sheer desperation, and the sight of the gas station's bright lights felt like a beacon of safety. As I ran, I could still hear the rumble of the truck's engine behind me, but I forced myself to keep going. The discomfort from my fall was nothing compared to the terror of staying in that truck. Reaching the gas station, I stumbled into the convenience store, breathless and covered in scratches. I stumbled into the gas station, my clothes torn and my skin scraped. My legs felt like lead as I dragged myself inside, and the relief of being away from that truck was almost overwhelming. The cashier looked up from behind the counter, his eyes widening in alarm as he took in my disheveled appearance. I was breathing heavily, my heart still racing from the adrenaline and fear. I quickly explained what had happened, my voice shaky as I recounted the harrowing ride and the strange behavior of the old man. The cashier listened, his concern growing with each detail, and he offered to help. After the brief but intense conversation, I rented a room at the small motel next to the gas station. The room was basic, but to me, it was a sanctuary. I could finally rest and feel somewhat secure, though the anxiety from the night's events lingered. The next morning, as the sun rose, I made a call to a friend who agreed to come and pick me up. When my friend finally arrived, I felt a wave of gratitude and relief. We drove away from that gas station and the horrors of the previous night, and I knew I was finally leaving the unsettling experience behind. As we headed back home, the sense of safety was almost overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the feeling of immense relief that I had made it out. So, my friends and I decided it was time for a camping trip, but not just any camping trip. We wanted to get as far from the usual spots as possible. We picked this remote area deep in the woods, hoping to find some real solitude and escape the usual crowds. When we arrived, the spot was exactly what we were looking for. It was isolated, surrounded by tall trees and thick underbrush, with no signs of other campers. We set up our tents, built a fire, and settled in for the night. Everything was going smoothly, and we were all in high spirits, enjoying the peace and quiet that only a secluded area like this can offer. The first night was perfect, clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the comforting sounds of the forest around us. We talked around the campfire, roasted marshmallows, and marveled at the stars. It felt like the ultimate getaway. We were all looking forward to a few days of uninterrupted nature and adventure, completely unaware of the strange events that would soon unfold. On the second night, things took a strange turn. Around midnight, we were all just hanging out, when suddenly, a gunshot rang out in the distance. It startled us and broke the quiet, but it seemed far off, so we shrugged it off and tried to get back to our relaxing evening. About 30 minutes later, the atmosphere changed. We started hearing rustling noises coming from the bushes at the edge of our campsite. At first, we thought it was probably some small animal, or maybe even another camper moving around. It was kind of unsettling, but we figured it was nothing to worry about. However, the rustling didn't stop. It grew louder and seemed to move closer. It felt like whatever was making the noise was circling our campsite. The sounds came from different directions, making it hard to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. We kept our voices low, trying to stay calm, but the growing realization that something was definitely out there started to make us all a bit jumpy. One of my friends, trying to figure out what was going on, grabbed a flashlight and shone it in the direction of the rustling. We all held our breath as the beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing to be seen. No animals, no people, just shadows and the occasional sway of the trees. Even though we couldn't spot anything, the noise didn't stop immediately. It gradually faded away, leaving us with an unsettling silence. We tried to shake off the tension and get back to our campsite routine, but the mood had shifted. The rustling had left us on edge, and no one felt comfortable, trying to convince ourselves it was just an animal or our imagination playing tricks on us. The uneasy atmosphere hung over us, and sleep was elusive as we lay there, each of us lost in our own anxious thoughts. A few hours later, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. Heavy breathing right outside my tent. I lay there completely still, trying to stay calm while my heart pounded in my chest. The breathing was slow and deliberate, moving around our campsite in a way that felt almost methodical. It was hard to tell exactly where it was coming from, but it sounded like it was getting closer to my tent. I could hear the rustling of leaves and the shifting of ground as whatever it was moved around us. The breathing seemed to circle our campsite, coming closer and then drifting away. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight with fear. I could barely breathe myself, trying to listen for any clues about what was out there. The same friend, who was in a nearby tent, must have heard it too. After what felt like an eternity, he decided to take action. He waited until the breathing had moved a bit farther away, then carefully unzipped his tent and peered out. With a flashlight in hand, he shone it in the direction of the noise. At first, he didn't see anything, but when he turned the flashlight a little to the side, he could see the shadow of what looked like something between a mountain lion and a bear, but it was different, and its eyes glowed in the darkness. He was paralyzed just looking at the thing. The fear was so bad that he froze, but within seconds the shadow moved quickly into the forest. When my friend came back into the tent, he was visibly shaken. He described seeing something really unsettling. He said the eyes were the creepiest part, bright and unblinking, reflecting the flashlight's beam. The creature didn't stay in the light for long, though. As soon as the flashlight hit it, the thing quickly vanished into the darkness, blending back into the night. All we could hear after that was the rustling of the bushes where it had disappeared. It felt like we were being watched from the shadows, and the fear was almost palpable. We were all too scared to move or talk, just lying there trying to process what had just happened. After the creature disappeared, we decided to check out the area where we'd heard the breathing. As we examined the ground, we found tracks that didn't match any known animals from the region. The prints were bizarre, with strange shapes and sizes that didn't fit anything we recognized. When dawn finally broke, we packed up our gear as quickly as we could. The sense of urgency was palpable. We were all eager to leave the woods behind. We hiked out for 2 hours, every rustle and creak making us nervous. By the time we reached the car and headed back home, we were all relieved to be leaving that creepy place. The experience had left us shaken, and we couldn't wait to get away from the woods and the strange events that had unfolded there. I got hired to work on this small family farm for the summer, and I was pretty excited about it. I'd been looking forward to doing something different for a change. The work was tough, planting, harvesting, and taking care of the animals, but it was straightforward. I thought it would be a nice break from the usual routine. The farm itself was way out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields and thick woods. It was pretty isolated, and the nearest town was a few miles away. The place was quiet, and you could barely hear anything besides the occasional rustle of the wind and the sounds of animals. Every day I'd start early, feeding the chickens, milking the cows, and getting the fields ready for planting. It was a lot of work, but it was also kind of peaceful in its own way. The farmer was a nice enough guy, but he was pretty reserved. We'd exchange the occasional word about the tasks or the weather, but mostly it was just me and the farm. I was settling into the routine, figuring out how everything worked and adjusting to the quiet, rural life. One evening while I was feeding the chickens, I started to notice this really strange smell. It was sickly sweet, kind of like something was rotting, but with a weird undertone that I couldn't quite place. At first, I thought it was just something decaying in the fields, but the smell seemed to be coming from the old barn nearby. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to check it out. The barn was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. It was one of those old, creaky barns that seemed like it hadn't been touched in years. As I pushed open the heavy door, the smell got stronger, and I could feel an uneasy chill in the air. Inside, the barn was filled with old crates and tools, dust-covered and neglected. I started going through the crates, trying to figure out where the smell was coming from. Then I found it. One crate in the corner was especially foul. When I opened it, I was hit with an overpowering stench of rotting meat. The crate was packed with decaying animal carcasses, piled up in a way that made my stomach turn. I slammed the crate shut immediately, my heart racing with disgust and fear. I bolted out of the barn as quickly as I could, trying to shake off the horrid image and smell. When I told the farmer about the carcasses I'd found, he barely looked up from his work. He just brushed it off, saying it was probably just old waste that hadn't been properly disposed of. According to him, it was nothing to worry about, and just something that had been left behind over the years. His dismissive attitude was unsettling, but I tried to let it go, figuring it was probably just me overreacting. But as the weeks went on, my unease grew. I kept finding more carcasses, hidden in different corners of the farm, behind piles of old equipment, and even in the tool shed. Each discovery was worse than the last, and the smell lingered in my mind, making me increasingly anxious. It felt like there was something seriously wrong, and the farmer's explanation wasn't adding up. Finally, I decided to confront him again. I asked him point blank about the carcasses, hoping for a more detailed answer. His response was cold and emotionless. "Some things are better left buried," he said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The way he said it, with that serious and almost indifferent expression, only heightened my sense of dread. Every time I found another one, my mind raced with questions and dark possibilities. The smell of decay seemed to cling to everything, and every shadow in the barn began to feel threatening. My paranoia started to spiral. Was there something I wasn't being told? Why was this happening? I spent hours trying to connect the dots. I even started keeping a journal of where I found each carcass, trying to see if there was a pattern or reason behind their placement. The more I uncovered, the more I felt like I was piecing together a disturbing puzzle. The idea that these weren't just random animal deaths, but possibly something more sinister, took hold of me. Finally, I couldn't take it any longer and decided to confront the farmer again. I approached him one evening as he was feeding the livestock, my nerves frayed from weeks of unease. "I need answers," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why are there so many carcasses hidden around the farm? What's really going on here?" His reaction was chilling. He didn't raise an eyebrow or change his demeanor. Instead, he looked at me with a cold, unyielding stare and repeated, "Some things are better left buried." His tone was final, almost dismissive, and it left me with a sinking feeling in my gut. It was clear that he wasn't going to give me any more information, and the sense of danger grew stronger. I began to feel like I was stepping into something that went beyond my understanding, something that was intentionally hidden from me. The farm, once a place of hard work and routine, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets and threats. My discomfort turned into a gnawing fear, making every creak and rustle around the farm feel menacing. I started questioning whether my own safety was at risk and wondered if I should leave before I uncovered more than I was meant to know. As my time on the farm drew to a close, finishing my contract became a bittersweet task. Every day felt like a balancing act between completing the chores and grappling with the unnerving discoveries I'd made. My interactions with the farmer were minimal, and he seemed to have grown even more reserved. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, making it clear that whatever secrets lay hidden were not meant to be uncovered. In those final days, I worked diligently, trying to focus on the tasks at hand, despite the pervasive sense of dread. I cleaned out stalls, tended to the animals, and made sure everything was in order. Yet, every creak of the barn and every shadow cast by the setting sun felt charged with a menacing undertone. The sense of being watched or monitored was impossible to shake off, and my attempts to maintain normalcy were overshadowed by a lingering anxiety. On my last day, I had a brief, almost mechanical interaction with the farmer as I wrapped up my work. He didn't offer any final words of thanks or parting wisdom. Instead, he simply nodded and went about his business, his face as inscrutable as ever. The lack of closure left me with an unsettling feeling, as though the final piece of the puzzle was deliberately withheld. When I finally left the farm, I couldn't shake the mixed emotions that swirled inside me. Relief that the contract was over, and I was heading back to the familiarity of my life, yet anxiety over the disturbing events that had unfolded. As I drove away, the fields and woods that had seemed so tranquil now appeared ominous and foreboding. The eerie experiences and the farmer's cryptic warnings left a lingering fear, making me question the true nature of what I had encountered. I was grateful to leave, but the sense of unease and the unanswered questions about the farm's dark secrets stayed with me, casting a shadow over what was supposed to be a simple summer job. Moving into college felt like stepping into a whole new world. I'd finally gotten away from home, and I was excited to start fresh. The dorm I was assigned to was old, like really old. You could tell it had been around for decades just by looking at the worn-out floors and creaky doors. There were rumors about it being haunted, but I didn't buy into any of that. To me, it just felt like part of the whole college experience. When I met my roommate, Anna, she seemed pretty normal at first. Maybe a little quiet, but nice enough. We introduced ourselves, did the usual "where are you from" stuff, and everything seemed fine. But after a day or two, I started noticing that she was kind of weird. She'd ask random questions like, "Do you ever feel like someone's watching you?" Or, "Do you believe in bad luck?" I laughed it off because it sounded like she was just being quirky, maybe trying to make small talk in her own way. I didn't think much of it. I figured everyone has their thing. The dorm itself didn't help with the weird vibes, though. It was so creaky and dark in the hallways, and the place just had this old, musty smell that never went away. At first, it all just added to the charm. I thought I'd get used to it after a while, and honestly, I didn't mind Anna's strange questions. I assumed we'd settle into some kind of routine and everything would be fine. Boy, was I wrong. Things started getting weird pretty fast. It was small stuff at first, stuff you could explain away if you tried hard enough. Like, one afternoon, I came back from class and found a couple of books lying on the floor. I figured maybe they weren't balanced right on the shelf and they just fell. No big deal. But then it kept happening. Books that were definitely secure would end up scattered across the room, like someone had knocked them down on purpose. Then there was the closet. I'm 100% sure I always closed it before bed, but every morning, I'd wake up and find it cracked open, just enough to make me uneasy. I tried telling myself it was just an old door that didn't latch properly, but deep down, it didn't feel right. Anna wasn't helping the situation. She was getting weirder by the day. At first, we'd chat now and then, but soon she barely talked at all. Most of the time, I'd find her sitting by the window, staring out into nothing. She wouldn't even move when I walked in. I tried asking her what was going on, if something was bothering her, but she would just shrug and go back to zoning out. It started to mess with me. I couldn't shake this creeping feeling that something was off, like there was something wrong with the room, or maybe even with Anna. Every night, I'd lay in bed, wide awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old building. It felt like the walls were watching me, and I couldn't explain why. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I was overthinking it, but the tension kept building. Something wasn't right. I just didn't know what yet. One night, I woke up with this weird feeling like something wasn't right. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and that's when I saw her, Anna, standing at the foot of my bed. Just standing there, not moving, not saying anything, just staring at me. My heart dropped into my stomach. At first, I thought I was still dreaming or something, but no, it was real. She was there, her eyes locked on me. I could barely breathe, let alone think straight. I managed to whisper, "Anna, what are you doing?" But she didn't answer. She didn't even blink. I kept asking, my voice getting shakier each time. "Anna? What the hell?" But it was like she wasn't even there with me, like she was somewhere else entirely. Then, without a word, she just turned around and walked out of the room, as if nothing weird had just happened. No explanation, no apology, nothing. I sat there in bed, frozen. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what just happened, but I couldn't. I didn't even know how long I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for something else to happen. Sleep was out of the question. I was too freaked out, too shaken by the whole thing. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see her standing there again, watching me, and the fear would hit me all over again. I don't know what that was about, but after that night, I didn't feel safe in that room anymore. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My mind was still reeling from what happened the night before. I wasn't sure what I expected when I saw Anna, but she acted like nothing weird had happened. She was sitting at her desk, casually eating breakfast, scrolling through her phone, just normal. It threw me off completely. I kept waiting for her to say something, anything, that would explain why she had been standing at the foot of my bed in the middle of the night. But she didn't. She didn't even look at me. I thought maybe I should bring it up, ask her what the hell that was all about, but the words just wouldn't come out. Part of me didn't want to hear whatever answer she might give. As the day went on, I couldn't shake this heavy feeling that something was really wrong with Anna. She was quiet, sure, but now it felt off in a way that I couldn't put into words. Every time I caught her staring out the window, or just sitting there in silence, I felt my skin crawl. The more I thought about it, the less it made sense, and the more I realized I didn't want to be around her any longer than I had to. That night, when I went to bed, I didn't feel safe. I kept one eye open, half expecting to see her standing over me again. My heart would race at the slightest noise, the creak of the floor, or the hum of the radiator. It wasn't just Anna's behavior, it was everything. The whole dorm, the weird little things that kept happening, and the unease that hung over me like a shadow. That's when I decided I needed to get out. I couldn't stay in that room with her anymore. I didn't care if it was irrational or if she had some kind of explanation for everything. I wasn't willing to stick around and find out. I made up my mind right there. I was moving out. The next day, I started packing, feeling both relief and a gnawing sense of anxiety that I was still missing something, some piece of the puzzle that would make sense of it all. As I packed my things, Anna didn't say a word. She didn't ask why I was leaving, and I didn't offer any explanation. I just wanted to get out before anything else happened. By the time I left, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but that lingering fear never quite went away. As I packed the last of my things and shut the door behind me, I was ready to put Anna and everything that had happened in that room far behind me. I moved into a new place across campus, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. No more weird late-night encounters, no more unsettling silences, just normal college life. But a few months later, I heard through a friend that Anna had left school. No one knew why. She hadn't told anyone, not her professors, not the administration. She just vanished. The news hit me harder than I expected. I thought back to all the strange things that had happened in that dorm room. In the end, I was a little relieved, but apprehensive about what could have happened to her. Valentine's Day rolled around, and I figured, why not treat myself? I made a reservation at this small, cozy restaurant I'd been wanting to try for a while. It had that intimate vibe, dim lighting, with soft music playing, and most of the tables were filled with couples. I kind of expected that, but honestly, it didn't bother me. It was nice just being there, enjoying my own company for once. The food was amazing. I ordered a steak, and it was cooked perfectly. As I sat there, savoring every bite, I felt this sense of contentment, like I didn't need anyone to make me feel good tonight. I took my time, sipping on a glass of wine, just enjoying the evening. There was something peaceful about it. As I was finishing up, though, I noticed a guy at a nearby table. He was sitting alone too, but it was the way he was looking at me that made me pause. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. It's a restaurant, people glance around. But this guy wasn't just glancing. It was like he was watching me. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking it, but the weird feeling lingered. I paid my bill, ready to call it a night and head home. After paying the bill, I gathered my things and stepped outside. The cool air hit me, and it felt refreshing after the warm, dimly lit restaurant. I was still feeling good about my solo night out, content with how the evening had gone. But as I started walking toward my car, I noticed something. That guy, the one who had been staring at me in the restaurant, was behind me. He wasn't far, and before I could even process what was happening, he caught up with me. He had this big, charming smile on his face, and I thought, okay, maybe he's just being friendly. He said he'd noticed me earlier, something about how I seemed interesting or different, and he wanted to say hello. It was one of those things that might have been flattering if it weren't for the weird feeling I had about him already. We made small talk. He was polite enough, but there was something about the way he focused on me, like he was paying too much attention, too eager to keep the conversation going. I tried to stay friendly, but the unease was growing. His attentiveness wasn't just flattering anymore. It felt off. I kept smiling, nodding along, but inside I just wanted to leave. I was starting to get that gut feeling that something wasn't right, so I gave him a polite, "Well, it was nice chatting, but I should get going." He didn't seem to take the hint, though, and that made me even more anxious. I started walking toward my car, hoping the conversation was over, but I could hear his footsteps behind me. He was still following me, staying close, and the more I noticed it, the more unsettling it became. I told myself maybe he was parked nearby too, but that uneasy feeling in my gut was getting harder to ignore. As I kept walking, he suddenly got bolder, reaching out to grab my hand like we knew each other. That's when the dread hit me, full force. My heart started racing. He acted like we had some kind of connection, but we didn't. I pulled my hand away quickly, not even trying to be polite anymore. This wasn't just weird, it was wrong. I sped up, my body going into full alert. I didn't want to break into a run just yet, but every instinct was screaming at me to get to my car as fast as possible. He didn't say anything, just kept walking behind me, his presence looming closer. Each step I took felt heavier with fear, like the distance to my car was stretching out longer than it should have been. I had to get away from him. I reached my car, heart hammering in my chest, fumbling with my keys as I unlocked the door. I could feel him behind me, way too close for comfort. The second the door opened, I slid in, slamming it shut and locking it as fast as I could. I thought I was in the clear for a second, but then I heard the sound of the passenger door handle being pulled. He was trying to get in. That's when it really hit me. This guy wasn't just being friendly. He was trying to make something happen, and it was nothing good. My hands were shaking as I started the car. I glanced over and saw him standing there, yanking the handle like he thought it would just magically open. I didn't wait around. I hit the gas, tires screeching as I sped out of the parking lot. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst, but at least I was getting away. When I looked back in the rearview mirror, I saw him standing on the sidewalk, staring after me like nothing had happened. Even though I was safe in my car, the fear still clung to me. As I drove away, I couldn't resist one last look in the rearview mirror. There he was, standing on the sidewalk, just watching me leave with a calm, almost casual expression. It was as if the whole thing was no big deal to him. My mind was racing as I drove, replaying the whole unsettling encounter. I was relieved to be out of that situation, but the fear was still there. I kept thinking about how close I had come to something dangerous. It was hard to shake the feeling of his gaze on me, even though I was miles away. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors with shaky hands, and I slowly calmed down, because I knew I was safe in my house. But from that day on, I became more alert to unknown people approaching me. I arrived in the small town with high hopes for my latest story. The place was charming in its own way, quiet streets lined with old houses, a few cozy shops, and locals who seemed friendly enough. It had that classic small-town vibe, which was just what I needed for my investigation into the town's history. My initial days went pretty smoothly. I met with a few residents who were happy to chat about the town's past. I gathered some interesting tidbits and uncovered a few intriguing leads. Everything seemed to be going well. I was getting plenty of material and felt like I was on the right track. However, as I dug deeper, I started hearing some odd warnings. A few people casually mentioned that I might want to be careful about how much I dig into the town's history. At first, I thought it was just the usual small-town paranoia, or maybe a local superstition. It didn't make much sense to me, but it did make me a bit curious. Despite the vague warnings, I decided to press on with my investigation. One evening, while I was staying in the rented house, something caught my eye through the window. I saw a group of people heading down a narrow, rarely used trail leading into the forest. Their movements were deliberate and somewhat secretive. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. I waited until it was dark, making sure I was as quiet as possible. I grabbed a flashlight, but kept it off to avoid being seen, and followed the trail into the forest. The woods were dense and unfamiliar, with branches scraping against my clothes and the ground crunching underfoot. My heart was pounding, not just from the physical exertion, but from a creeping sense of unease. As I crept deeper into the forest, I was feeling that something wasn't right and got more oppressive. I finally reached a clearing where I saw something truly disturbing. A group of people, dressed in dark robes, were gathered around a makeshift altar. They were performing a ritual that involved chanting in a language I didn't recognize, and there were strange symbols drawn on the ground. In the center, there was a grotesque arrangement of what looked like animal remains. The whole scene was macabre and unsettling, a stark contrast to the peaceful town I had initially encountered. I watched in shock, feeling a growing sense of dread as the ritual unfolded. A few minutes passed and I was still crouched behind a tree, trying to stay hidden. But suddenly, a person who was probably late and came along the same small path saw me. I didn't think twice. I ran into the forest. I scrambled to my feet and bolted into the forest, the branches whipping against my face and the ground uneven beneath my feet. I ducked behind a large fallen tree, pressing myself into the cold earth and trying to stay as quiet as possible. After a few agonizing minutes, I cautiously peered out from my hiding spot. The sounds had faded, but my nerves were frayed. I took a deep breath and made a break for it, sprinting back along the trail to the house. My mind raced with the urgency of escaping the forest and the danger I had narrowly avoided. I was desperate to get back to the safety of the temporary residence, my fear escalating with every step. In my frantic state, I hurriedly grabbed my car keys and packed up my most important belongings. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my laptop and notes into my bag, desperately trying to remember if I had everything I needed. I could barely think straight, my mind consumed with the terror of what I'd just witnessed and the fear of getting caught. With my heart pounding in my chest, I raced out the door and jumped into my car. I threw the bag onto the passenger seat and fumbled with the ignition, barely able to get the engine to start. The whole time, I could feel my anxiety mounting as I glanced around, expecting someone to appear at any moment. As I drove away, I noticed something through the rearview mirror. People from the town were standing in front of the house, looking in the direction of the car. They were just standing there, watching me leave. I sped away, but things took a turn for the worse when I passed the small path through the woods. In a brief, horrifying glimpse, I saw a figure standing off to the side, partially covered in what looked like blood. My fear grew even more. The sight was so grotesque and out of place that I couldn't help but gasp. I pressed the accelerator as hard as I could, my hands gripping the wheel tightly, my breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. All I could think about was getting out of that place as quickly as possible. As I finally reached the highway and sped away from the small town and its dark secrets. As I finally merged onto the highway, I let out a shaky breath, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. The smooth road felt like a lifeline, The tension in my body began to ease, albeit slowly. My heart was still racing, and my sweat-soaked clothes clung to me uncomfortably, a stark reminder of the terror I had just experienced.